but we want to bring in our next guest, who we are very, very honored to be joined by here, who is Tara Houska, who's an Indigenous lawyer, water protector, and organizer. Tara, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you. I wanted to just get your first thoughts here. I mean, when the DNC opened, they did open with some words from some representatives of a Native nation, I think in the essence of trying to show that they really are in tune with the idea of Indigenous rights. And I just sort of wonder what you think about that sort of, that being their messaging, but also, where we really stand in terms of what Harris has done and the Biden administration has done over these 4 years. And maybe, in the future, do you really think they are embracing Indigenous sovereignty and rights in a serious way?
I think land acknowledgments are the embodiment of neoliberalism and the belief of putting together a series of pretty words and doing very, very little to actually implement those words, right? Which is what we're seeing on pretty much every facet of the agenda, whether that's climate or whether that's human rights or whether that's actively stopping a genocide, right? It's words, but not actions. I'm Anishinaabe. Chicago is my people's traditional homelands. And to see that gross caricature of respect for Indigenous people while actively exterminating Indigenous people is, that speaks for itself.
Yeah, it's just the land acknowledgement to open is so stunning, especially considering what's happening in Palestine, not to mention what happens across the U.S. And I'm curious if you could perhaps, update us on where the Democratic Party stands on the issue of Indigenous rights in the U.S. It wasn't that long ago that Standing Rock was in the news. It was a dominant headline and certainly has fallen out from liberal circles. We certainly don't hear the Democrats talk about that or access to resources or the pollution of resources across the country, particularly in areas where they still don't abide by various agreements they have with Indigenous tribes.
Standing Rock, that entire resistance and all of the police brutality and tanks out on the prairies of North Dakota on the traditional treaty lands of the Lakota people, all of that happened under the Obama administration. I then left standing with those relatives over there because the pipeline was built to come to my own homelands over in Minnesota, where Tim Walz was the governor, and then fought another pipeline and was brutalized again by law enforcement. And the creation of a federal, state, and private security task force called the Northern Lights Task Force. Minnesota actually learned from Standing Rock and chose to engage in actively facilitating over $8 million worth of money that Enbridge, the company, poured into local police and into our Department of Natural Resources. Directly engaged in destruction of land, territory, and our rights to hunt, gather, and be well. These are treaty rights that were guaranteed for the creation of this country. But how quickly they forget, right? Now they're touting Tim Walz as a climate champion because of a few small band-aids that were put on to pacify after approving the largest tar sands infrastructure project in North America. That is the Democrats' policy that I've seen. More oil and gas leases approved during the first 2 years of the Biden administration, with Deb Haaland leading the Department of the Interior, than the Trump administration, right? These are the folks that call themselves climate champions. These are the folks that are saying, we are going to do different and we are a different party. No, you're going to put band-aids on as you actively destroy and continue to pillage and irrevocably harm nature. And at this point now, we're going after, it looks like we're looking at active attacks on humanity, right? Genocide is not just an attack on Palestinian people, it is an attack on all of humanity. We are watching children being killed every single day. Right before this, I'm looking at the inside of a child's head, and then switching to Democrats ripping and grinning to a stadium of people all cheering and talking about how great they are, right? It's like, how can you live with yourself? How can we live as people and to continue to function knowing that something so egregious and evil is happening? It is not just an assault on them, it's an assault on us all.
Well, and Tara, I'm glad you brought up the Northern Lights Task Force. Another thing that I think our listeners might be interested to know here, the spokesperson for that task force, John Elder, was also the spokesperson for the Minneapolis police after the George Floyd killing, who put out the initial press release saying that George Floyd had resisted police officers and only, quote unquote, appeared to be suffering medical distress. Thankfully, the video of that brave bystander came out to show it. But another interesting connection. But I also say that just to maybe, and of course, anything you want to comment on that, I'm happy to hear as well, Tara. But I also wanted to ask you to go and maybe just say a little bit more about the police brutality against the water protectors and others at Line 3, when Tim Walz is governor of Minnesota, because I think that's a heavily overlooked issue.
I think when you bring up those direct connections between, I mean, that's what we're saying when we talk about intersectionality, right? Like, it is not just Palestinian liberation. It is not just Black Lives Matter. It is not just, water is life. These are all so deeply intertwined and interconnected. There is a reason why cop cities are being built all over the United States, right? Like, there is a reason why we see this growing unrest and this very multifaceted effort to suppress that unrest. In Minnesota, it was the same types of tactics, heavy surveillance. At one point in my private home, I had on a dirt road, I was living about 300 yards off the pipeline route for a number of years. I had police officers show up by the dozens to tell me that my driveway was no longer a driveway, and they blockaded it and arrested over a dozen people. 50 police officers lined up in a riot line in a dirt road to try to suppress and harass and scare us. That's ultimately what they were trying to doing. Sending over, DHS helicopters almost every other day. Then denying those helicopters. That actually took an NPR journalist who was dusted by one of those helicopters to say, no, I took a picture of it. It happened to me. They're not lying, right? The same types of things you see with any of the Ferguson protests, with any of the folks who have done in any way, shape, or form standing up against the state, right? Like, that is, the brutality continues and the suppression and active attempts to silence continue, which is assaults on free speech, assaults on individuals, going after them through RICO. I'm currently being sued for $4 million alongside a bunch of other folks over for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which was another Democrat handoff, right? Like, they overturned over a decade worth of grassroots pressure and local pressure to stop the Mountain Valley Pipeline to then get their Inflation Reduction Act, right? And they gutted parts of the Clean Water Act and NEPA and all kinds of bedrock environmental law to do it.
Wow. I also, by the way, was not aware of Tim Walz's role in what you described when it comes to Indigenous issues. But I'm curious if you could also speak. I know you've already touched on this a lot, but when it comes to, Kamala Harris is the vice president in the Biden administration. She doesn't have much policy on her website, so I'm just going to go ahead and assume her ideas for an administration, unless she has said otherwise, will be a continuation of what we see now. What has been Biden's record on climate justice?
Yeah, I touched a little bit on the fact that what I see is a pattern of behavior that is throughout the so-called left, right, which is the Democrats, right? Like, I don't really know that they're necessarily left. I think that the U.S. version of left is actually more central, right? Like, it keeps getting shoved further and further right. It's a pattern of drill, baby, drill, but we'll also engage in some solar panels and electric cars, right? Like we will continue to wage a full on war on the finite natural resources and homelands and habitable space that we as human beings need to live, while trying to electrify the grid. That is not climate solution making. It is not in line with science. It's not in line with any desire to provide our children a habitable home. We are actually actively stealing from the next generation. I mean, that's when we talk about the seventh generation, which I'm sure that many land acknowledgments do. I mean, those are not just pretty words. That's a real concept of we are stewards, right? We are holding on to what belongs to someone else. And it's not just human beings, it's all of us, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, I see their policies and it is pretty heartbreaking, to say the least, that these are the folks who call themselves climate champions. And that's what passes for a climate champion in the current state of affairs.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, it really is. It really is something. I'll just say it like that, to see that this is, what's presented as so-called transformative change. Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us. I know you have a lot going on. Tara Houska, water protector and organizer, thanks so much for joining us here on this special DNC show on Free Speech TV and Breakthrough News.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thanks for your work.